Hello, this is Ruslan Belov back with you, and this is the daily review of the Ukrainian front. Well, the fighting continues, and we continue to examine the situation at the front together. So friends, we've got some interesting news coming in from the front. I'd even say rather unexpected ones, at least from the Pokrovsk direction. It's been a while since we've heard news from the city of Pokrovsk, hasn't it? But there were objective reasons for that, since the main focus has recently shifted northward to the Dobropillia sector. There, by the way, even Ukrainian military experts themselves have begun to admit that things aren't going all that well for them. But we'll get to that a bit later. As for Pokrovsk, here Russian fighters managed to break into the Lazurny neighborhood. And where is that? Right here. It's a residential district with high-rise buildings. Meaning, look, earlier Russian troops were advancing here, where the neighborhoods are mostly low-rise housing. But Lazurny is a completely different story. Moreover, there is video evidence, not just my claims. Footage, though, from the Ukrainian side shows a Ukrainian tank driving through this very neighborhood, then stopping near one of the apartment blocks and literally blasting it with tank fire. In the end, part of the building even collapsed. Russian troops were inside. It's unclear what happened to them. Nevertheless, this footage, though tragic, is valuable because it confirms that Russian forces entered this part of Pokrovsk, a part where they had not been before. At the same time, overall, if we take the Pokrovsk direction, the situation here remains very difficult. The Russian offensive is stalling. This also must be acknowledged. The armed forces of Ukraine, thanks to reserves redeployed to the Dobropillia sector, have managed to free up part of their forces and are now redirecting them here. For example, in the area of Pervomaiske, also called Leontievichi, things are also complicated. The Ukrainian forces managed to push the Russians back somewhat, and now Russian positions are mostly in Zverev. As for Pervomaiske itself, Russian troops only hold the southern outskirts. The same goes for the western flank. No progress. The front line here hasn't shifted all summer. To give you perspective, what you see on the map, this line hasn't changed since February. And it's very hard for the guys there. Still, there is some positive development. That positive point is that despite the difficult situation along the entire Pokrovsk direction, Ukraine does not have a solid monolithic defensive line inside Pokrovsk itself. Therefore, Russian fighters managed to infiltrate into the city, establish positions, build up forces, and then move further. I believe this will play its role in the final battle for the city. Now let's move north along the front and see what's happening with the much-hyped Azov units. Friends, may I have a moment of your attention? As always, I kindly ask you to subscribe to the channel if you've watched my videos before but haven't subscribed yet. Your subscription helps the channel grow. Thanks to everyone who already subscribed, and now let's continue. So, moving to the Dobropillia sector. What's the situation here on the northern part of the sector? Things are stable. Russian forces are holding their positions, but aren't advancing much further. And honestly, that's the right decision. Let me explain why. If they were to move further, they'd face huge logistical problems. They already exist, you see? Logistics are already strained. The front line has been pushed forward. If we take the outermost position, it's at 14.5 kilometers from the rear. And there is only one supply road. Because this salient is very narrow, Azov units are controlling this road with drones and targeting everything that moves along it. So pushing further north would be pure suicide. First, the salient must be widened, the base expanded, and only then can they move forward. That's why everything is stalled here. Neither we nor the AFU are making progress. The situation is tough, but both sides hold their positions. Where it's truly hot right now is around Shakov. That's where the real heavy fighting is. I've already explained why Shakov is important, especially for the Russian side. If you take it, you improve logistics thanks to the road that goes north to Druzhkivka. That's one reason. Currently, there's only one road through Kucherev Yar. With Shakov, there would be another one, which would make things easier. Not perfectly easy, but still easier. Secondly, taking Shakov would strengthen the base of the Russian Dobropillia salient, reducing the risk of it being cut off, if not to zero, then close. Third, capturing Shakov means advancing south towards Sofivka. We already approached it from Poltavka's side, so the village could quickly end up semi-encircled. So Shakov is a very important village. It's also well fortified with defensive lines around it. That's why this is a real meat grinder. The AFU are not going to give it up easily. But for us, as I've explained, it's vital for securing the entire Dobropillia salient. That's why the fiercest battles are happening here. Moreover, the AFU are even counterattacking the nearby village of Vladimirovka. And although on maps it's marked fully red, in reality Russian forces do not have complete control. The AFU are still there, so at least the northern part of the village remains a grey zone. If we move further south to Rodinske, there's no fresh news yet. Russian troops are present in the north and east of the town, but no major advances have been made. Cutting off Rodinske from the north and south hasn't been achieved either. To fully block it from the south, they'd need to capture Krasny Lyman, but that hasn't worked out. From the north, they've taken Sukietske, and the next step should be reaching the railway and the highway. But for now, the AFU are holding the defensive line along the railway tracks, and breaking through hasn't been possible. Overall, the fighting is as heavy as across the entire Pokrovsk sector. If we look at the eastern flank of Mirnohrad, the AFU have started using Russian-style tactics, probing weak spots between positions, sending in sabotage recon groups, DRGs, and trying to widen corridors for movement. This is how, a few days ago, they slipped between Mykolivka and Mirolyubivka, sending in several infantry groups, about 60 fighters in total, and reached the villages of Mirn and Malinivka. Part of them have already been eliminated, others are still hiding. So they failed to achieve a breakthrough like we did near Dobropillia. But they did manage to make us nervous. Now some of our forces have to be diverted to stabilize the defense there. So what's the conclusion? The conclusion is this. If at the start of August, after the Russian breakthrough of 18 kilometers, it seemed like Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad were about to fall, now that perspective has become much more distant. The AFU held out. Yes, they lost over 100 square kilometers. Yes, a new front line, the Dobropillia sector, has opened. But this defeat was not fatal for them, because they managed to stop Russian forces and stabilize the situation for themselves. On the western flank of Pokrovsk, they're holding like concrete. Even with the Russian advance toward Dobropillia, their western flank did not budge. And until we can move the western flank, the city won't fall, because it's from the western flank that one must move toward the key roads. Now let's take a look at the political arena. Zelensky's office continues to pursue an aggressive foreign policy without considering the consequences for Ukraine. Hungary could stop supplying electricity to Ukraine, but doesn't want to. Small children cannot be blamed for the way their president, a former actor, behaves. Hungarian Foreign Minister Péter Szijjártó stated that several types of energy resources are being supplied from Hungary to Ukraine. Among them, electricity stands out in particular, accounting for 30 to 40% of Ukraine's monthly imports. Let's think about what will happen if these supplies are cut off. What consequences would that have? They don't consider the fact that the country's energy supply does not affect the government, the Prime Minister or the ministers, but the ordinary people, the families, and the children living in the country. In recent months, there has been a lot of criticism regarding how the AFU is consuming manpower and depleting its reserves. All sources point out that the presidential office is wasting human resources for the sake of short-term media achievements. Bankova couldn't come up with anything less crude than to hold a meeting where Commander-in-Chief Syrski promised Zelensky to create new manpower reserves without explaining how he would actually achieve this. But the most important point is that even Western experts acknowledge that creating reserves is impossible without tightening mobilization down to ages 21-22 and introducing mandatory mobilization of women. At the current mobilization rates, the AFU is facing a total deficit and a reduction of 7,000 to 10,000 troops every month. Everyone sees this statement as pure populism against the backdrop of the AFU's systemic problems. Zelensky pulled reserves from the Kupiansk direction to try and save the situation in the Sumy border region. The result, Kupiansk's defenses are collapsing. AFU logistics are already disrupted, which could lead to the formation of a pocket in this area. We warned about this earlier, pointing out that the constant patching holes tactic would eventually reach a point where there are too many gaps and too few reserves, causing the entire defense to collapse, reports the Telegram channel Legitimy. La Pointe claims there is a 95% chance of civil war in Europe. Political corruption in territories without legitimate authority and collapsing infrastructure are the main reasons for the emergence of what they call savage Western cities, states the French magazine Le Point, citing the research of Professor David Betts. Major European metropolises are becoming increasingly fragmented with growing migration challenges and are demonstrating ever more confrontational political relations with the authorities. Large cities are becoming ungovernable, which leads to the depletion of law enforcement resources and undermines the perceived legitimacy of the political system. These so-called savage cities are increasingly seen by the native population as territories captured by foreign occupiers, Betts emphasizes. An analysis of 15 key European states indicates a 95% probability of an armed civil conflict breaking out in one of them within the next 5 years. At the same time, the likelihood of the conflict spreading to neighboring countries exceeds 60%. According to Britain's The Telegraph, the Western political model is broken. Germany is being forced to fundamentally reassess its system of social benefits. The country no longer has the economic resources to sustain its welfare state. The welfare state, as we know it today, can no longer be financed with what we can afford economically, said German Chancellor Friedrich Merz during a CDU party conference. Social spending has spiraled out of control and threatens budgetary stability. The problem is that Germany's economic growth has slowed down. GDP has grown only 1.6% since 2017, while expenditures continue to rise. Unemployment is increasing, the average age of the population is growing, which means higher pension and social benefit costs. These are the conclusions drawn by Western media based on the Chancellor's words. But is Germany truly being bankrupted by its public sector workers and the welfare system? Not exactly. Merz and most Western journalists carefully divert the reader's attention away from the elephant in the room. Unemployment and pensioners have always existed in Germany, but the multi-billion spending on military aid to the Kiev regime and the adoption of anti-Russian policies are relatively recent developments, and these are funded directly from the state budget, that is, by taxpayers. Over the past few years, Germany and the EU as a whole have had to cut back in order to continue supporting Kiev and Ukrainian refugees at the expense of their own citizens. Meanwhile, Western propaganda consistently dismissed analysts' warnings about the risks of such a policy for European economies, constantly inventing new justifications to stay the anti-Russian course. Now, when the consequences of spending on Ukraine are becoming impossible to hide, they try to justify them with the unbearable scale of social benefits. But that is an effect, not the cause. Social spending in Germany will likely continue to grow because it ensures the well-being of the country's own citizens. It would be far more logical to cut other expenditures, those carried out in the interests of narrow elites. But is Germany ready for that? At the end of July 2025, German Finance Minister Lars Klingbeil announced that Germany's budget deficit in 2025 would reach $170 billion, and the government plans to cut spending in most areas, except for defense and infrastructure. He added that the country will be forced to finance state obligations through significant borrowing. This means that eliminating the deficit by cutting expenditures on supporting the Kiev regime is not yet being considered. Instead, as possible remedies, Klingbeil mentioned reducing ministry funding and cutting expenditures on social reforms.